Was it Mary who got the most out of Ernest? The person?
You know, that would probably be really hard to say. Certainly she was the one that was married to him the longest, so I suppose you could say that. But she had to tolerate a lot. I mean, Ernest, in his later years, became very hard to live with and was often very verbally abusive to Mary. And so she probably tolerated more than the other wives did.
Your own, this is obviously a labor of love, like so much of many of your other projects. How long? From conception to
well, it actually, I guess you would say 15 years, because I started 15 years ago gathering the research, and I was really researching in order to properly restore the house and the barn in Piggott. But the more I looked into it, the more I realized that the Pfeiffers' contribution had really been ignored, or if not, very little attention had been given to it. I also became aware that many people had misconceptions about Pauline and her relationship with Ernest, and it was partly because Pauline died 10 years before Ernest. So what people knew about Pauline is basically whatever Hemingway told them. His other three wives had the good fortune to outlive him, so they could write their own books, and all three of his wives have written books or had books written about them and their relationship with Ernest. But Pauline was pretty much left, you know, to whatever Ernest said. And so a lot of Hemingway scholars felt like Pauline was a manhunter who purposely went after him and took him away from Hadley. And, you know, that to me just doesn't make any sense. I mean, why would she have gone after Ernest? He wasn't famous when she met him. He didn't have a college degree. He had no money. He, you know, had a child. He was married. He was scruffy looking. Why would she have gone after him? I think she just, you know, fell in love with him and couldn't help herself.
Yeah, the current flowed, so to speak.
Right. And so, you know, all these things, I just really felt like somebody needed to write. I had no intention of writing a book, but I felt like somebody ought to put it all down. And so I really had to squeeze it in between all of my other projects. And so really, I guess I started writing it about 10 years ago. And of course, every year that came along, I would find more information and think, oh, I'm glad I didn't publish that last year because now I can include this. But, you know, there does come a time when you have to pull the trigger and go ahead and get it out there. And even now, I'm still finding information that's coming in that answers some questions that I wish I would have been able to answer in the book.
Well, there's the next edition.
Yeah, right. I guess that's why people do next editions.
Yeah. The Hemingway's heirs, you had three sons. Were they cooperative? Did they assist? They were Jack, Patrick, and Gregory.
Yes. Well, of course, when Pauline died, it was Patrick and Gregory because Jack was a stepson, although Jack was Hadley's son. But Pauline and the Pfeiffer money helped to set up a trust for Jack, and she really treated Jack like her own. He came to Piggott with them for the summers and so forth. But Patrick and Gregory, after she died, they obviously inherited part of the house. Patrick even moved to Piggott for a time after his mother's death because he wanted to see what that whole farm operation was like. I think he found very quickly that having the last name Hemingway, he wasn't really all that welcome in Piggott at the time because people knew that Ernest Hemingway had divorced Pauline and of course took Pauline's side of things. And so he really was there for a short time and then went to Africa. But the sons pretty much stayed in touch with each other.
Yeah. What sort of access did they give you?
I was very fortunate when I started the book because all three sons were still alive. Now Patrick is the only one alive, but all three of the sons were gracious and more than helpful, and anytime I called them with a question, they not only answered the questions but pointed me in other directions for where I might look to find other references and that kind of thing. Gregory, of course, came when we did our grand opening in 1999 and did the dedication at the grand opening. Patrick would have come, except he was on his own book tour at that time.
Mm-hmm. And Jack, I guess, was still overseas, or was had Jack died? I'm sorry.
No, Jack and Gregory both died in 2001.
Okay.
But Jack, I believe, was in Idaho at the time.
The two later Hemingway son, Patrick and Gregory.
Mm-hmm.
Pauline, he has his children with Pauline. But I can ask about all three. They had to wrestle with that name, that last name, and it was difficult. And how did they manage that?
Well,
and what was their sense of the breakup of their parents? Did that scar them in a way that?
I'm not so sure the breakup itself scarred them as it did the whole relationship. Patrick, all his life, sensed that his parents wanted a girl, because Ernest Hemingway did want a girl. And he had two sons, and when Gregory was born, he was somewhat disappointed that Gregory wasn't a girl. And I think Gregory sensed that. I think he knew that his mother was disappointed in not being able to please Ernest by giving him a girl. So he was very insecure, and then when his mother went off and left him for the African safari, he actually began what resulted in cross-dressing. He started out by going to his mother's bureau drawer and getting her silk stockings out and kind of rubbing them against his face because it made him feel close to his mother, which I find very sad. But he wrestled all of his life with his sexual identity. He wound up cross-dressing, and eventually in the later years of his life he had a sex change operation. So that's, you know, he had a very hard time with it.
Yeah.
Of course, you know, when he died, it was partly related to his cross-dressing. His mother, when his mother died, it was partly related to his cross-dressing, because his mother was in San Francisco at the time and got a call from her sister Virginia in Hollywood saying that Gregory had been arrested. So Pauline went to check and see what was going on. He had been arrested. He had been cross-dressing and was in a women's restroom, and they had arrested him. And so Pauline called Ernest in Cuba to let him know what was going on. And later that evening, when Ernest called back, they got in a huge argument. And Ernest basically said if she'd been a better mother, their son wouldn't have turned out that way, and so forth. And really upset Pauline, and her blood pressure wound up going sky high, and they rushed her to the emergency room, and she actually died on the operating table. It turned out that she had a tumor that was triggered by stress, and all of that stress fired it off, and she wound up dying. And I don't think Gregory ever got quite over that. So it's interesting that Gregory died exactly 50 years to the day and almost to the hour when his mother died. And just as he was in jail when his mother died, he was in jail 50 years later when he died. But I found Gregory to be a very wonderful person, obviously very mixed up, but certainly he could not have been more gracious when he came to Piggott. He loved his Pfeiffer grandparents and had really fond memories of coming to Arkansas. And just really teared up over coming back.
Not to belabor it, but I think Gregory also had alcohol and drug problems
He
too,
did.
complicating.
He did. I mean,
psyche.
he did have a lot of problems.
You talked too about how the work, some of it done in Piggott, you had not admired at first or even necessarily liked, but you came to appreciate that Hemingway voice much, I suppose, as the rest of the world did, because it was something new when he began to publish.
Right. Well, Hemingway
Your appreciation of the artist exceeded greatly your appreciation of the man.
Absolutely. I love Hemingway's style of writing because he writes very simple sentences that seem very simple, yet they're very complex. He subscribed to what he called the iceberg theory, which is that when you wrote, you should only leave the tip of the iceberg exposed. The rest of it ought to be buried underneath for the reader to discover for themselves. And that was a very difficult thing to do. I mean, people say that writing's both an art and a craft, and certainly for Hemingway that was true. He really worked and rewrote and rewrote. He said he wrote the ending of A Farewell to Arms 50 times. Now, I think that was an exaggeration probably, but the point being that he wanted to get just the right words, and I could appreciate that.
Well, in fact, is there not? I think there's a new edition being published which includes some of those alternate endings.
Yes, there is, you know, and that's gotten to be real popular with Hemingway's work. They just came out with A Movable Feast was published after his death, but it was put together by Mary, and now his grandson has edited an edition called the Revised or the Restored Edition, which puts back in a lot of things that were left out of that other edition. So it's gotten to be real popular, I think, to go back and look at Hemingway's earlier drafts and to incorporate some of that.
Right, and of course there's a raging debate in the literary community whether, I think, was it Islands in the Stream that was published posthumously?
Yes, several books.
I'm trying to keep my time.
Yeah.
And the argument from some aficionados was that Papa didn't want this published, period, or this story published, period, or he didn't want these letters out. Thank goodness at least they still exist, whether or not they were...
Well, I think, he also said that he didn't want any of his letters published, and every one of them that has ever been found has, is out there. But, I think if he didn't want them published, why was he so meticulous about saving them and saving copies of letters that he wrote to people? And I mean, he kept them filed alphabetically, and he had Pauline sorting his letters to keep them all alphabetized. So I'm not so sure, methinks he doth protest too much maybe, but it is true, I think, that there have been a number of his works published posthumously, and it's really hard with a writer like Ernest Hemingway to do something like that, because you do know that he wrote and rewrote, and so the fact that something is put out there before he's put his final stamp on the rewriting that's a difficult thing to do.
The tortured artist aspect of Hemingway, a lot of serious literary people, which excludes me,
and me,
believe that he lost his gift began to diminish pretty much after he some of the reportage anyway from World War II was pretty gripping stuff. But from that point, they don't even like The Old Man and the Sea. They found it saccharine. Some find it saccharine and unworthy of him. He obviously complicated his own creative process, or maybe some would argue he kept it going with massive quantities of alcohol. Did you find yourself musing over the second half of his literary life?
Well, I really think that a lot of that did have to do with him divorcing Pauline. I think that he considered her his best editor. He even said after, when he was working on For Whom the Bell Tolls, and they had separated, and he told his Maxwell Perkins, his editor in New York, that he said, well, you know, Pauline is my best editor, but she hates me so much now that she won't even look at it. Of course, she didn't hate him, and maybe because she loved him too much is why she didn't look at it. But even The Old Man and the Sea was resurrected from a short story that he wrote in the 1930s when he was still married to Pauline. So I like to think that part of that is because he didn't have Pauline pushing him as an editor and critic. But then I think a lot of it was in those later years, he was very ill. He was in several plane crashes that he was always accident prone throughout his life. He was always cutting the pupil of his eye or breaking his arm or cutting his head or gashing his forehead or whatever.
Well, he head-butted his way out of an airplane that
Yes,
crashed.
he was in 2 crashes in Africa and used his head to butt his way out. And you know, I maintain that he suffered a lot from that accident that really probably did not get diagnosed. And of course, at the end, he wound up having shock treatments. He was very depressed and was bipolar. His whole family was basically bipolar. And you know, when back then they treated that with shock treatments, and shock treatments basically destroyed his ability to write. And I think that's what led to his ultimate suicide, is that he was not able to write, which is what he loved, and there was not really any point in staying around.
Suicide wasn't a stranger, as you noted, to the Hemingway family at all.
Yes, Ernest's father committed suicide, his brother, his sister, his granddaughter, the actress Margot Hemingway, all of them committed suicide. And so I do think it was, you know, a gene that ran in the family.
But Piggott was formative, you think?
I think
Piggott, or nurturing at the very least.
I think nurturing would certainly be the word for it. I think that the Pfeiffers encouraged him, supported him financially, gave him a place away from everything where he could write. I mean, even some of his material, certainly the short story A Day's Wait, is based on an incident that happened right there in Piggott, so right there in the house. So it directly impacted him in some ways.
I will ask a question that I already know the answer to, and that is, as a historian, you have obviously been able to build your work as a tool of history, and that's the printed page, words on paper, not in cyberspace. where they get lost. Are you, this is such an obvious question, aren't you grateful that the internet and that email didn't exist in 1920 or 1917?
Absolutely, because the book has been built almost entirely. It's built on 2 things. Number 1, oral history interviews, and thank goodness that I did those when I did, because of the 26 people I interviewed, 13 are now dead. So I have those, and the rest of the book is really built on letters, not just letters from the Hemingway collections, but I went through and I read the letters of F. Scott Fitzgerald and John Dos Passos, and even Helen Keller, because Helen Keller was a friend of the Pfeiffer family. But all the people, Elizabeth Bishop, all John Dos Passos, Sherwood Anderson, because I knew that there would be a mention in those letters of what was going on personally. So I had to read all of those letters. Had the internet been here then and email, those letters wouldn't have existed. So I don't know what scholars are going to do in the future.
Maybe they can take some tips from Ruth Hawkins.
I don't know about that.
Thank you for a real work of scholarship and a marvelous read. Ruth Hawkins, thank you very much.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you for joining us.